Chapter 1, The Stage to Cedar Hollow. The stage came down out of the pass with its wheels crying for grease, and Clara Bishop held to the window frame and watched Cedar Hollow rise up out of the dust like something the land had grudged into being. It was a lean town. She saw that at once. A single street of weathered board fronts, gray as old bone, a mercantile with a sagging porch, a church whose steeple had gone silver in the sun, and beyond the roofs the great brown shoulders of the hills, treeless and hard. There was nothing soft in the whole picture but the light, and even that had a thin, wintry quality, though it was only the tail of summer. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, and the stage lurched to a halt that near put her teeth through her tongue. Clara gathered her carpetbag and her good gray traveling cloak and stepped down into the street. Her boots raised a little cloud that hung about her ankles and did not settle. A knot of townsfolk stood along the mercantile porch, and she felt their eyes go over her the way a buyer's eyes go over a horse he does not mean to purchase. She was young and travel-stained and alone, and she had learned long ago to meet such looks straight on. "Good afternoon," she said. "I'm the new schoolteacher, Clara Bishop." A woman near the rail sniffed. A man spat brown into the dust. Nobody offered a hand. "Teacher," a fellow in a stained vest said, as though the word tasted of something gone off. "They found us another one, then." "Another one," Clara repeated pleasantly. "You've had a run of them." "We've had a run of folks come to eat and go," the man said. "Town don't need extra mouths, miss. Time's bane what they are." She might have answered that a mouth that teaches is not the same as a mouth that only eats, but she had crossed half a continent to be here, and she did not mean to spend her first hour making enemies. So she only smiled and asked the way to the boarding house, and a boy of 10 was pushed forward by his mother to walk her there without a word said between them. The boarding house was a 2-story frame at the far end of the street, its porch swept clean, geraniums fighting for their lives in a pair of tin cans by the door. That small effort at brightness told Clara more about the woman who kept the place than any letter could have. She thanked the boy who fled and knocked. The door came open on a broad, rosy, sharp-eyed woman of 50 or so, wiping flour from her hands onto an apron that had seen 1,000 such wipings. "You'll be the teacher," the woman said. "We heard the stage. I'm Martha Coleman. Come in out of that dust before it works into your good cloak. Lord, they've sent us a young one this time." "Clara Bishop, and I'm older than I look, Mrs. Coleman." "Everybody is in this country. It ages a body backward, makes you look young and feel 80. Martha stepped aside, and Clara came into a hall that smelled of bread and beeswax, and something in her chest that had been braced for miles finally loosened a notch. "Supper's at 6. Room's at the top of the stairs, the one with the yellow curtain. Best light in the house, which isn't saying a great deal." Clara set down her bag. "The town didn't seem overjoyed to see me." "The town isn't overjoyed to see anybody it has to feed." Martha said it without heat as a plain fact of weather. "Don't take it to your heart. They're not cruel folk. They're only frightened folk, and frightened folk pull their purse strings and their smiles tight both at once. It's been 3 lean years. When the ground gives you nothing, you learn to give nothing back." Clara warmed her hands on the cup and let the strong, bitter smell of it steady her. Through the window she could see the street emptying toward supper, doors closing one after another down the gray row, and she thought that a town could be a lonely thing even when it was full of people, if none of them wanted you in it. And the last teacher, the man in the vest, said there'd been others. Martha's face did a small, careful thing then, closing partway like a shutter against sun. She poured coffee that could have stripped paint and slid a cup across the table. "The last one left in the night," she said. "Middle of April, didn't draw his final wages, didn't say goodbye to a living soul, just gone and his bed still warm, they say. Nobody rightly knows why. The schoolhouse has sat shut since. You'll find it wants sweeping and worse." "Left in the night," Clara said slowly. "That's a strange way for a man to quit a place." "It's a strange country, Miss Bishop. You'll get used to strange." Martha's eyes came up, and for a moment the gossip's shrewdness in them went soft and almost kind. "Or you'll leave like he did. I'll be honest and hope you don't, because them children could use somebody who stays." Clara turned her cup in its ring of spilled coffee and did not answer that, because the answer was longer than the woman knew. She had come west for wages and for distance, both, but under those reasons ran a deeper current she rarely showed anyone. She had been a child in a great gray charity asylum back east, one of 40 girls in a dormitory that froze in winter and stank in summer, marched to chapel and marched to labor, called by numbers as often as by names. She had learned her letters there, and had loved a matron who taught them to her, and that one warm hand in all that cold had made the difference between the woman she became and the ruined ones she had watched fall. She remembered still the particular sound of 40 children breathing in the dark, and the particular silence of the ones who had given up. She remembered being counted like a sack of meal and found wanting. She knew to her marrow what a forgotten child was. She had been one. And so when a town told her it had no room for extra mouths, some old buried coal in her stirred and glowed, though she showed the world only a level, teacherly calm. "I mean to stay," she said. "You may tell them so." Martha laughed, short and pleased. "I'll tell them nothing. They'll believe it when they see it, and not 1 minute before. That's Cedar Hollow." Clara took the afternoon to walk the town, to know the shape of the place that was to be hers. She found the schoolhouse, a single room, dust an inch deep on the desks, a dead bird by the cold stove, but sound in its walls and honest in its bones. She found the church and the smithy and the well. And on her way back up the street in the long gold slant of the failing afternoon, she found the man. He was loading feed sacks into a wagon outside the mercantile, and she noticed him first for his size and then for his stillness. A big man, dark-haired, perhaps 35, moving with an economy that spoke of great strength held always in check. He wore no expression at all. He swung the hundredweight sacks up as though they were pillows one after another and never once looked at the people passing, and the people passing never once looked at him. But they went a little wide, she noticed, the way folks step around a grave. When he had done, he climbed up, took the lines, and drove out without a word to anyone. There was no cruelty in the way the town avoided him, and no unkindness either. It was more the wariness folk keep for a wound they do not know how to dress, and so leave covered. "Who is that?" Clara asked a woman near the water trough. The woman followed her glance and lowered her voice, though the wagon was already gone. "That's Josiah Reed. Has the ranch out past the Hartley place." She hesitated. "Buried his wife and his little boy both 2 winters back. Fever took them inside a week of each other. He hasn't spoke 3 words together since, they say. Keeps to his land. Good man once. Now," she shrugged, and the shrug said the rest. Now he was a thing the town did not know what to do with, and so left alone. Clara watched the dust of the wagon thin and vanish toward the hills. She could not have said why the sight of him stayed with her, a big silent man carrying weight down an empty street. But it did and would. Dusk came down over Cedar Hollow, the color of a healing bruise. Clara was crossing back toward the boarding house, her mind full of desks and slates and the long work ahead, when a movement at the corner of the mercantile snagged her eye and pulled her whole attention around. A child, a girl thin as a rail fence, 11 perhaps, in a dress that had been another child's before her and gone gray past all telling of its color. She crouched by a bushel basket the storekeeper had set out for scraps, bruised apples, a few gone soft and brown, and her hands went into it quick as a bird's beak, snatching, stuffing the ruined fruit into a sack she wore against her chest. She worked in a terrible practiced silence. She did not eat a single one, and that was the thing that stopped Clara's breath, for a hungry child eats. A starving child crams the first mouthful in before the second is even in its fist. But this girl only gathered and hoarded and kept, her jaw set hard against the want of it. Every apple went into the sack, and Clara understood with a small, cold drop of the heart that this meant the food was not for the girl alone. Somewhere there were others, smaller than she, and she had made herself their keeper. The child's head came up. For one instant her eyes met Clara's across the darkening street, enormous eyes in a pinched face, the eyes of something wild that has been hunted. And then she was gone, ducking behind the water barrels, flitting down the gap between the church and the smithy, out toward the ragged edge of town where the buildings gave up and the sage began. Clara stood a moment in the falling dark. Every sensible thing in her said to go on to supper, to Martha's warm kitchen and her yellow-curtained room. A stranger's first evening was no time to go chasing shadows into the sage. She went after the child instead. She kept well back, her cloak gathered close, moving quiet along the fence lines the way she had learned to move quiet a long time ago in a place she did not like to remember. The girl never looked behind her. She had the walk of someone who has stopped believing anyone will follow. Past the last house, past a fallen corral, out along a track worn faint through the brush toward a black bulk of building Clara had marked earlier and thought abandoned. The old Hartley barn, roof swayed, one door hanging, the whole of it leaning tired against the coming night. The girl slipped through the gap of the hanging door and was swallowed. Clara came up the last of the track on soundless feet and stopped, her breath held, her heart going hard against her stays. The barn was supposed to be empty. Everyone had said so, an empty barn on abandoned land. But through the split boards of its wall there leaked a thin, wavering, unmistakable light. A lantern turned low. Someone had a lantern lit inside the empty barn. And then, faint under the wind's dry whisper through the sage, she heard it small and muffled and worn thin with going on too long. A child was crying in there. Clara Bishop stood in the dark with her hand pressed flat against the rough gray boards, and the old coal in her chest that the town had stirred to a glow now caught full and burned. She did not yet know what waited on the other side of that wall. But she knew already, with the certainty of one who has lived it, that whatever it was, she was not going to walk away. She reached for the hanging door. Chapter 2, What the Barn Was Hiding. The lantern glow bled through the warped slats of the Hartley barn like something ashamed to be seen. Clara Bishop stood in the dark a moment longer than she meant to, her hand pressed flat against the weathered door, listening to the thin sound of a child crying inside. It was not the loud, healthy wail of a babe wanting supper. It was worse than that. It was the small, exhausted weeping of someone who had learned that crying rarely brought anyone. She had crossed an ocean of her own such nights, long ago, in a stone building back east with narrow beds and colder charity. She knew that sound the way she knew her own name. Clara pushed the door. The hinge groaned and the crying stopped as if a hand had clapped over it. The lantern swung. And in its jerking light she saw them. Not one child, not two, but a whole clutch of small, filthy faces pressed back into the straw and shadow, eyes gone huge and white with terror. For one heartbeat nobody moved. The air smelled of dust and old hay and the sour tang of unwashed bodies too long without a bath. Then a boy came up out of the dark with a pitchfork. He could not have been more than 13, all elbows and jaw, his shirt 3 sizes gone and his boots held together with twine. But he set the tines of that pitchfork level with Clara's breastbone and planted himself square between her and the smaller ones, and his voice, when it came, did not shake though the rest of him did. "You take one more step, ma'am," he said, "and I'll run you through. I swear before God I will." Clara did not move. She looked down the length of the pitchfork at the boy holding it and understood, in the cold and settled way she understood most things, that he meant every word, and that he was praying she would not make him prove it. "I believe you," she said quietly, "so I'll stay right here." She lifted her hands, slow, palms out, and let her market basket swing gently from the crook of her arm so he could see it. "My name is Clara Bishop. I'm the new schoolteacher. I came in on the stage 2 days past." She kept her voice low, and even the voice she'd used on frightened first-day children in a dozen frontier schools. "I saw a light. I heard someone crying, that's all. I'm not from the county, and I'm not from any almshouse, and I've got no wagon and no men behind me. It's just me." The boy's eyes flicked to the basket, then back to her face. Behind him, a small hand tugged at his trouser leg. "Sam," it was a girl's voice, older than her years. A slip of a thing edged forward into the light, perhaps 11, with a dirty braid falling over one shoulder and a smaller boy of 4 or so clamped to her hip, his face buried in her neck. She had the wary, weighing look of someone who did the deciding for others. "Sam, she's alone, look at her." "Don't matter she's alone, Nell," the boy said, not lowering the fork. "Fewer of 'em is how they get you, sends one nice one first." Clara's heart turned over at that, sends one nice one first. Somewhere, sometime, that had happened to them, and they had learned it the hard way. "That's wise," she said, and meant it, and saw a flicker of surprise cross the boy's face. "You're right to be careful. I'd be careful, too, in your place. I have been in my place." She lowered herself slowly until she was crouched down small in the doorway, no taller than the girl called Nell, her skirts pooling in the dirt. "Look, I'm sitting, I'm not coming in, and I've got bread." She drew the loaf from the basket. It was a plain brown loaf Martha Coleman had sent her off with that morning, wrapped in a cloth, and Clara had not touched it. She broke it in her 2 hands, and the smell of it, warm, still, yeasty, ordinary, went out into the barn like a struck match. 6 pairs of eyes followed her hands. She heard someone swallow. The little one on Nell's hip lifted his head at last, and Clara saw a wan 4-year-old with enormous solemn eyes and a mouth pressed to a thin, silent line. "I'll set it here," Clara said, and laid half the broken loaf on the flat of the doorsill. "And I'll move back, and it's yours. No one has to say a thing for it. No one has to come near me." She shuffled back a pace on her heels. and folded her hands in her lap and waited. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the smallest ones broke. Two little girls, twins by the matched look of them, no older than 7, darted from behind an overturned wagon and fell on the bread with a desperation that made Clara's throat close. Nell was there in an instant, breaking its smaller, pressing pieces into their hands, into a younger boy's hands, a solemn dark-haired child of 9 who hung back and cradled one arm strangely against his chest, and last of all into the mouth of the little one on her hip, who ate what she gave him and made no sound at all. Only when they had all had some did Nell take the smallest crust for herself. Clara watched the girl feed 6 mouths before her own and thought, 11 years old and already a mother, and no one had ever fed her first. The boy Sam had lowered the pitchfork by degrees until the tines rested in the straw. He stood breathing hard, watching Clara as if she might yet turn into something with teeth. "Won't you have some?" Clara asked him gently. "Not till you tell me what you want." His jaw worked. "Folks don't feed a body for nothing. There's always a price on the far side of it." "Sometimes there is," Clara agreed. "Not this time." She unwound the shawl from her own shoulders, good gray wool the warmest thing she owned, and held it out at arm's length, not rising, not pressing. "The little one's shivering. Take it, please." Nell hesitated, then reached and took it and wrapped the silent 4-year-old in it, and the boy at last let the pitchfork fall. His name was Samuel, she learned, sitting there on the cold sill as the light failed outside and the barn went blue with dusk. Nell did most of the telling. The words came out of her flat and quick, a report given many times. There was Eli, the 9-year-old with the bad arm, who had gashed it on a nail a week gone and now would not use it. The twins were Rose and Ruth, and the little one who did not speak was Toby. "He talked before," Nell said, tucking the shawl closer around him. "For his ma and pa took the fever. He ain't said a word since the wagon, near a year now." She said it without self-pity, the way she said everything, as a thing that simply was. "And the almshouse?" Clara asked, though a cold certainty was already forming in her. Samuel spat into the straw. "Turned us out. County man, Vance, the superintendent, come to the yard back in the spring and read off names. Said the rolls was too long and the state stipend too thin and we was old enough to fend." His mouth twisted on the word. "Old enough, Toby's 4. Rose and Ruth can't reach the pump handle." "They put you out to starve," Clara said. "Put us out," Nell said, "but not off the books. That's the thing of it, ma'am. Deacon Prout come by after, private-like, and told Sam we'd best not go far and not go telling. Said we was still wards on paper. Said the state still pays the county to keep us." She looked up, and in her thin face was a knowledge no child should carry. "They get money for us. They just don't spend none of it feeding us." Clara sat very still. She had thought over a hard life that she had run out of ways to be shocked by what the strong did to the small. She had been wrong. Fraud, she thought, drawing coin from the state for children they had left to eat bruised apples behind a mercantile. It was not neglect. Neglect was an accident. This was a ledger. And she knew, sitting there, exactly the shape of the men who kept such a ledger, because men like that had kept the accounts of her own girlhood in the stone house back east, where the matrons had eaten mutton and the wards had eaten gruel, and no one had ever asked the children whether the sums balanced. She had promised herself, the day she walked out of that place with her teaching certificate and her $12, that she would never again stand by while a grown soul made money off a hungry child. She had thought it a promise she would never be called to keep. Here it was, come due in a cold barn on the edge of nowhere, and she found she meant it more than she had ever meant anything. "Eli," she said, gathering herself, "let me see the arm." The boy would not come at first, and it was Nell who coaxed him, and Samuel who at last pushed him forward by the shoulder. Clara unwound the filthy rag and made herself keep her face smooth, though the sight of it turned her stomach. The gash had gone bad. The flesh around it was swollen tight and shining red, hot as a stove lid under her fingers, and a thread of angry color had begun to crawl up toward the elbow. Eli's eyes were glassy. When she laid the back of her hand to his brow, it came away damp. The boy was burning. This was past bread and a shawl. This was past what she could mend with the little she had. She tore a clean strip from her own petticoat and bound the arm loose and gentle, and she gave Eli the last of the water in her flask, and she made her voice sure the way you did for the sick. "You've been so brave," she told him. "All of you braver than grown men." She looked round at the ring of watching faces. "Now I need you to be brave once more and stay quiet and stay hid and trust me one night. I'm going to come back, tomorrow at dusk with more food than this and something for the fever." I promise you. Everybody promises, Samuel said, but the fight had gone out of it. It came out tired. I know, Clara got stiffly to her feet at last, so I'll not ask you to believe me. I'll just come and you'll see. She looked at each of them and last and longest at the silent boy wrapped in her shawl. Tell no one you saw me, and I'll tell no one I saw you not yet, not a soul. Do you understand? For now it has to be our secret or the wrong ears will hear. Nell nodded, grave as a judge. Our secret. Clara left the rest of the bread and the whole of the shawl and rode out from the Hartley barn into full dark with an empty basket and a chest so full of feeling she could scarcely draw breath around it. 6 of them. 6 children put out to die on the books of the state. And a 9-year-old with poison climbing his arm who would not last many days without a doctor's help. Help she did not know how to find in a town that had greeted her with folded arms and shut faces. She was so deep in it, so blind with the fury and the fear, that she did not hear the other horse until she was nearly upon it. Her mare shied and Clara hauled the reins, and out of the dark loomed a broad shape astride a tall bay, a man hatted still as stone, the starlight catching the hard planes of his face. Josiah Reed, the widowed rancher she had seen hauling feed in the street, the one they said had not spoken 3 words since he buried his wife and his boy. He sat his horse not a length off, and he was not looking at her face. He was looking at the empty basket on her arm and the torn hem of her petticoat, and she realized with a lurch at the naked cold of her shoulders where her shawl should have been. For a long moment the man said nothing at all. The night hung between them. Then Josiah Reed spoke, low and rough like a hinge long unused. Who, he said, are you feeding out there? Chapter 3, The Rancher's Word. The dark held them both a moment longer than it should have. Clara's mare shied sideways, hooves scraping the frozen ruts of the road, and the basket on her arm tipped so that a heel of bread rolled loose into the dust. Josiah Reed leaned from his saddle and caught it before it landed, his big hand closing over the crust the way a man closes a door against weather. He looked at the bread. Then he looked at her. Who are you feeding out there? He asked again. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned to wait for answers because he had waited so long for so much. Clara had prepared a dozen lies on the ride back from the barn. Every one of them died in her throat. There was something in the way he sat his horse, still, patient, without heat, that made a lie feel like an insult to them both. And she was tired. Tired of carrying it alone since the night before, tired of the fear that had ridden her shoulders like a second passenger. Children, she said. The word hung between them in a cloud of breath. There are 6 of them, she went on, because now that the truth had started it would not stop. In the old Hartley barn. The county almshouse turned them out to fend for themselves, to cut them off the feeding, and then kept their names on the books so the state keeps paying. The eldest is 13 and stands in front of the little ones with a pitchfork. The youngest is 4 and hasn't spoken a word since his folks died. One of them, a boy named Eli, is sick, burning up. I've been bringing what I can carry. She lifted her chin, ready for the thing she expected from every soul in Cedar Hollow. So now you know. If you mean to tell the superintendent, tell him, but you'll have to ride past me to do it. For a long moment Josiah said nothing at all. Then without a word he turned his horse, not toward town, not toward his own dark ranch waiting beyond the ridge. He turned back the way she had come, toward the Hartley barn, and clicked his tongue for her to follow. Mr. Reed. Josiah, he said, already moving. If we're to do this in the cold, we'll do it on first names. Come on, show me the sick one. The barn smelled of old hay and fear and unwashed children. When the door groaned open, the lantern within went out in a single frightened breath, and Clara heard the scuffle of small bodies pressing into the dark. It's me, she said quickly. It's Miss Bishop, it's Clara, I've brought a friend. You said you'd come alone. That was Samuel, the 13-year-old, and there was steel under the boy's cracked voice. She could just make out the pale shape of him rising in the straw, the pitchfork tines catching what little starlight leaked through the boards. You promised. I know I did. Clara moved slowly, hands open. And I'll never break a promise to you again if I can help it. But Eli needs more than I can give him. This man has medicine, he has blankets and food, he has a warm roof if it comes to that. She heard Josiah strike a match behind her, saw the small flame bloom, and watched his face come up out of the dark, weathered, bearded, careful. He did not step toward the children. He crouched down where he stood, made himself small, set the lantern he'd relit on the floor between them so the light fell on his own face and not into their eyes. "My name's Josiah Reed," he said. "I run cattle east of here. I'm not from the county and I don't work for it." He let that sit. "I heard there's a boy in here that's poorly. I've nursed men and horses and I've buried some too, and I'd rather do the first than the second. Which one of you is Eli?" Nobody answered. Then a thin, hot cough came from the corner, and Nell, 11 years old and already worn to a little mother, said softly, "Here, he's here. He won't hardly wake." Josiah crossed the barn on his knees rather than his feet, and Clara understood, watching him, that he was making himself no taller than the tallest child in the room. He laid the back of his hand against Eli's forehead and went very still. "How long's he been like this?" "3 days," Nell whispered. "It started in his arm. He cut it on the fence wire." Josiah peeled back the filthy sleeve. Even in lantern light, Clara could see the red climbing the boy's forearm, the wound gone yellow and angry at its heart. Josiah's jaw tightened, and for the space of a breath something moved across his face that had nothing to do with the boy in front of him and everything to do with some other child, some other fever, some other night he had lost. She saw the wall in him crack. She saw him set his shoulder against it and hold. "This can't wait for morning," he said. "This one comes with me now tonight. The rest—" He looked around at them, at the twins Rose and Ruth clinging to each other, at little Toby half hidden behind Nell with his enormous silent eyes. "The rest I'll fetch supplies to and we'll settle what's next. But the sick boy rides in front of me where I can keep him warm." Samuel had not lowered the pitchfork. "And then what?" he said. "You take him off and we never see him again, or you take all of us and ride us straight back to Vance for the reward money. I've heard that song before, mister. Every grown man's got a kind face till the paper's signed." Josiah turned and looked at the boy for a long, level moment. He did not stand, did not use his size, did not raise his voice. "You've been let down by every man wore a collar and carried a ledger," he said quietly. "I don't fault you for pointing that fork at me. In your place I'd do the same, and I'd have done it sooner." He drew a slow breath. "So here's my word, and I'll give it to you plain so there's no mistaking it. I will not hand you back, not one of you. Not for money, not for the county, not for the law itself, till a judge and God both make me. A man's word, son, once it's given, is a roof that don't leak. Mine's over you now, whether you want it or not." The pitchfork wavered. "Words are cheap," Samuel said, but the steel had gone soft in it. "They are," Josiah agreed. "That's why I don't spend many." He held out his hand, not to shake, just open, palm up, an offering the boy could take or leave. "But this one I'll pay in full, you'll see." Samuel looked at the hand a long time. He did not take it, but he set the pitchfork down against the wall, and in that small surrender Clara felt something in the frozen barn begin, at last, to thaw. They worked through the deep of the night. Josiah rode Eli back to his ranch bundled in his own coat, then returned within the hour with a wagon and his arms full of the plain wealth of a working ranch. Wool blankets thick as saddle pads, a crock of salt pork, a sack of meal, a tin of medicines, a jug of clean water, and a bottle of something that smelled of turpentine and iron that he used to draw the poison from Eli's arm while the boy whimpered, and the others watched with wide, wondering eyes. Clara held the lantern and passed him what he asked for, and somewhere in the passing of cloth and cup they found a rhythm, the two of them, wordless and easy, like people who had kept house together for years instead of hours. When his hands were full, she wiped his brow. When her arms tired, he took the light without being asked. Once their fingers met over a folded blanket, and neither one pulled back as quick as courtesy required. And in the lantern glow Clara saw him notice it too, and saw him look away, and understood that whatever grief this man carried, it was the kind that had a shape a woman could stand beside. "You've done this before," she said softly, watching him spoon warm broth between Eli's cracked lips. "Nursed a child." His hands did not stop. "I had a boy," he said, "and a wife. Fever took them both one winter, 3 days apart." He wiped the child's mouth with a gentleness that told her everything he did not say. "I told myself I was done with all of it. Told myself a man could get by on cattle and quiet." He looked just once at Toby, who had crept close and fallen asleep at last against Josiah's leg with one small fist knotted in the man's sleeve. "Seems the good Lord wasn't done with me." "How old was he?" Clara asked. "Your boy." "Would have been 6 this spring." Josiah set the cup down and was quiet a while, and the lantern threw the shadow of his bent head up the wall behind him. "Name was Caleb. He had a way of following me into the barn of a morning before the sun, wanting to help. Couldn't lift a bucket, but he'd try. I'd let him carry the little empty pail so he'd feel he was working. His voice roughened and steadied. I stopped going into the barn for the better part of a year. Couldn't stand the quiet of it, that pail hanging on its nail. He looked down at Toby's small fist knotted in his sleeve, at the trusting weight of the child against his leg. Now here's a whole barnful of them, and me back in it again at 4 in the morning. Funny how a thing you swear off comes calling when you least deserve it. You deserve it, Clara said, before she had decided to. A man who rides toward 6 starving strangers in the dark instead of away from them deserves a good deal more than a barn. He did not answer that, but she saw the words land, saw him tuck them somewhere careful, the way a poor man pockets a coin he did not expect. Clara did not answer. There was nothing to say that would not be too small. She only reached over and drew the blanket up over the sleeping 4-year-old, and let her hand rest a moment on the boy's thin back, and felt Josiah watching her do it. You said you'd never break a promise to them again, he said. That mean you aim to stay in this? I do. Then we're in it together. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, as though it were already settled, and only the words were late in coming. I'll not have you carrying 6 children alone on a schoolteacher's wage and a basket of bread. By the time the black of the window had gone to the deep blue that comes before dawn, Eli's fever had broken. The boy slept clean and cool for the first time in 3 days, and the twins had crept into the curve of Clara's arm, and Nell had fallen asleep sitting up with her chin on her knees, still keeping watch out of habit. Only Samuel stayed awake across the barn, his back to the wall, watching the man who had given his word. You still don't trust me, Josiah said to him quietly, not looking up. No, sir, Samuel said. Josiah nodded slowly, as if that were the right answer, the only honest one. Good, he said. Keep it that way till I've earned it, then hand it over all at once. And for the first time, the ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed the boy's hard young face. The sun came up thin and yellow over Cedar Hollow, and it found Deacon Prout already at work. He rode down the frozen Main Street with a fistful of tacks and a roll of printed notices under his arm, and at every post and door and storefront he stopped and hammered one home. The paper was still wet with ink. Across the top, in heavy black letters a body could read from a horse, it said, WANTED, 6 runaway wards of the county. Beneath that, smaller, reward offered for information. By order of Superintendent Ambrose Vance, Cedar County Almshouse. Martha Coleman, sweeping her boarding house step in the raw morning, read it over the deacon's shoulder and went very still. And out at the edge of town, in a barn that no longer stood empty, a teacher and a rancher slept on either side of 6 sleeping children, not yet knowing that the paper had come, not yet knowing that the roof they had raised in the dark would be tested before the day was through. Chapter 4, Superintendent Vance. The county almshouse sat a mile east of Cedar Hollow, a long gray building with narrow windows and a fence that leaned like a tired man. Clara had passed it once from the stage and thought it a granary. Now, walking up the frozen ruts of its lane with her chin high and her heart hammering, she understood it was something colder than that. Even the smoke that rose from its single chimney seemed reluctant, thin and blue, as if the fire inside had been rationed too. She had told no one she was coming. That was a lie she'd let stand with herself for 3 miles, and it fell apart the moment she admitted why. If Josiah had known, he would have insisted on riding with her, and a man like Josiah Reed at her elbow would have announced to Ambrose Vance that something had changed. She needed the superintendent to see only what she chose to show him, a schoolteacher, new and earnest, offering a small kindness, nothing more. A boy of perhaps 10 opened the door when she knocked. His wrists stuck out of his sleeves like the handles of tools, and his eyes went to the covered basket on her arm before they went to her face. She had brought biscuits on purpose. She wanted to see how the children here looked at food. He looked at it the way Nell had looked at it in the barn. I've come to see Superintendent Vance, Clara said gently. Is he in? The boy stepped back without a word and led her into a hall that smelled of lye and old porridge. Somewhere behind a shut door, children were reciting sums in the flat, joyless drone of a lesson learned under threat. Clara held her basket a little tighter. Vance's office was warm. She noticed that at once, and hated that she noticed it, that the one room with a proper fire belonged to the man who apportioned the rest of the house its chill. He sat behind a broad desk stacked with ledgers, a spare man with a clean collar and a face like a closed account. He did not rise. "Miss Bishop," he said before she could give her name. "The new teacher." Word travels in a place this size. He gestured to a chair with 2 fingers. "Sit, if you like. To what do I owe it?" Clara sat. She set the basket on her knees. "I've heard the almshouse keeps a number of children," she said. "I wondered whether any might be spared for a few hours a week at the schoolhouse. I've room on the benches, and a child who can read and cipher is worth more to any employer than one who can't. It seemed a waste to have them within a mile and never teach them." Vance's mouth moved into something that was not a smile but occupied the same place on his face. He drew a ledger toward him and opened it, and Clara saw the columns, names down one side, and beside each a figure, and beside that another figure, and every line ruled straight as a fence wire. "You speak of them as though they were a benefit to educate," he said. "Let me acquaint you with the arithmetic, Miss Bishop, since arithmetic is your trade as well as mine. Each ward on these rolls draws a stipend from the state. Board keep instruction, the county is reimbursed for the whole. A child in a schoolroom is a child not at labor, and a child not at labor is an expense with no return." He turned a page without looking at it. "I am not unkind. I am accurate. There is a difference the sentimental never learn. And the children who," Clara chose the word carefully, "leave the rolls, who run or are turned out." Something crossed his face then, quick as a shadow of a bird, and was gone. "Runaways," he said, "are recovered. The county does not surrender what the state has paid it to keep." He closed the ledger. "You have a soft look about you, Miss Bishop. Soft looks do not last a winter out here. My advice, freely given, teach the children who are brought to you and do not go seeking those who are not." She understood him perfectly. He did not know she had already found them. He was warning her off a road he did not know she'd walked to the end of. The knowledge sat in her chest like a live coal she had to keep from her face. "I was raised in a house not unlike this one," she said before she could stop herself. She kept her voice even, almost pleasant. "Back east. So you needn't explain the arithmetic to me, Mr. Vance. I learned it young. I only ever noticed that the men who kept the ledgers were never the ones who went hungry." For the first time, Vance looked at her as though she were a person and not a category. His eyes narrowed a fraction, weighing her, and Clara felt she had said one word too many and made herself smile through it, a teacher's harmless smile. After a moment, he let it go. "Then you'll know better than most how the world is arranged," he said. "Good day, Miss Bishop." She stood, thanked him for his time in a voice she kept level, and left the biscuits on the corner of his desk, where he did not touch them. The boy with the sticking-out wrists let her out. At the door, she pressed a biscuit into his hand, quick and low, and his fingers closed over it before he had decided to let them. She did not look back at the gray house. She was afraid of what she might do if she did. By the time Clara reached the edge of town, the light was going amber and long, and Deacon Prout was standing on the mercantile porch. She saw him before he saw her and made herself slow, made herself an ordinary woman walking home. Prout was broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who used them, and he had the mercantile owner, Fenn, backed against his own doorframe in a conversation that only one of them was enjoying. "Somebody's buying heavier than they were a month past," Prout was saying. His voice carried the way a man's does when he wants it to. "Flour, salt pork, more than one mouth's worth, more than two, a man notices running a store." "You'd notice." "Folk lay in for winter," Fenn said. "That's all winter is, laying in." "Sure," Prout smiled without any part of it reaching past his teeth. "You just keep noticing and you tell me what you notice. There's coin in it. Superintendent's generous to friends." Clara passed on the far side of the street with her basket, her eyes down, her pace even, and felt Prout's gaze slide over her and move on, a schoolteacher, nobody, a soft look that would not last a winter. She got past him. She did not breathe right until the mercantile was 2 buildings behind her, and even then the breath came shallow. He was close. He was asking the exact question that led straight to the Hartley barn, and Fenn, honest as he was, could only shrug it off so many times before somebody less honest answered it for him. They had to move the children, tonight. Josiah did not argue when she told him. He listened the way he did everything, without waste, his jaw set and his eyes on the middle distance while she laid it out, Vance, the ledger, Prout on the porch, the questions circling. When she finished, he said only, "The bunkhouse is dry and it's mine, and no notice on a wall gives a man leave to walk onto my land." Then he was up and reaching for his coat. They did it in the dark of the moon, which was mercy and hazard both. Josiah brought the wagon around behind the Hartley barn with rags tied over the traces so the chains wouldn't ring, and they carried the children out one at a time into the straw-lined bed. Samuel would not be carried. He walked, and he counted heads twice before he'd climb up, the way Clara had learned he always did. Nell came with Toby wrapped against her like a second heartbeat, the little boy silent as ever, his eyes enormous over the edge of the blanket. The twins, Rose and Ruth, held hands and did not let go the whole ride. Eli was better than he'd been. Josiah's medicine had broken the worst of the fever. But Clara kept a hand on his forehead the length of the road and felt him warm and alive under her palm and was fierce about it. The ranch received them without a sound. Josiah lit no lamp until every child was inside the bunkhouse and the door was shut, and then only a single one, hooded low. In its light the children looked around at the plank walls, the tight roof, the row of bunks with real ticking, and something in their faces that had been braced for a year began, cautiously, to unclench. Nell laid Toby in a bunk and tucked the blanket to his chin, and Clara watched the girl's shoulders drop half an inch, as though for the first time in a long time she was permitted to be 11. "Nobody knows this place but us," Josiah said, low, crouched to Samuel's height. "You've my word on it a second time. That barn's empty now. Far as the world's concerned, it always was." Samuel looked at him a long moment. "Folks always find out," he said. It wasn't defiance. It was worse than defiance. It was information delivered by a boy who had it on good authority. "Maybe," Josiah said, "but you'll not be there when they come looking. You'll be here behind me. That's the difference." He held the boy's eye until Samuel, grudging, gave him the smallest nod a person could give and still mean it. It was Martha Coleman who nearly undid the whole careful thing, and then instead held it up. She caught Clara on the boarding-house stair the next evening, coming in with hay on her hem and the wrong kind of tired in her face. Martha had run a boarding-house for 20 years, and there was not a lie in Cedar Hollow she hadn't heard rehearsed at her own table. She folded her arms. "You go out at dark and come back at dark," she said. "You buy bread you don't eat. You've straw on your good skirt and a look about you like a woman keeping a secret too big for one pair of hands. Now I've held my tongue 3 days, which for me is a feat you may quote in church. But I'll not go on watching a decent girl ruin herself on I don't know what and say nothing." Her chin came up. "So, is it a man or is it trouble?" Clara stood on the stair with her heart going hard. She thought of Vance's ledger and Prute's smile and 6 children asleep in a bunkhouse a mile out, and she understood she was one careless answer from disaster, and also that she was so tired of carrying it alone that her arms shook. "It's children," she said quietly. 6 of them, and it's trouble. And I'm going to tell you, Mrs. Coleman, because I think under all that talk you're a good woman, and because I can't do this by myself, and neither can he." Martha's arms came slowly unfolded. She looked at Clara for a long moment, and whatever she saw there settled it. "Come into the kitchen," she said, and her voice had gone rough. "There's coffee, and you'll tell me the whole of it from the barn on." Clara went, she told her, and when she was done, Martha Coleman set down her cup with a click and said the thing that made her an ally for good. "Well, then we'd best figure how to keep them, hadn't we? Because I've buried too much in this town to watch that gray house on the hill eat 6 more. That same night, a mile from the boarding house and a mile from the ranch, Deacon Prute stood in the ruin of the Hartley barn with a lantern raised. The straw was flattened where bodies had lain. A fire pit sat in the corner, ringed with river stones, and he crouched and laid his broad hand flat against the ash. Cold, but under the top layer, deeper down where he dug 2 fingers, still faintly warm. A day, no more. He turned the lantern, and its light caught something small half-trodden into the dirt at the edge of the pit. He picked it up, a child's shoe worn through at the toe, sized for a foot no bigger than a loaf of bread. Prute turned it over once in his hand, then looked west, out through the broken barn door, toward the low, dark shoulder of the hills where a single ranch kept its lamps. He smiled, and this time the smile went all the way up. "There you are," he said to nobody, to all of them, and he pocketed the shoe. Chapter 5, A House Full of Small Voices. Morning came to the Reed ranch the way it hadn't come in a long while, loud. Clara stood at the stove with a dish towel over her shoulder and listened to it the way a person listens to rain after a drought, half afraid it would stop. There was the clatter of a spoon dropped on the plank floor, and Rose's giggle, and Ruth insisting it had been Rose who dropped it, and the soft creak of the bunkhouse door as Samuel came in from the yard with his hair still wet from the pump. There was Eli, color back in his cheeks at last, sitting up at the long table, and asking, in a voice gone greedy with health, whether there would be more of the flapjacks or whether he'd have to fight Toby for the last of them. Nobody had to fight anybody for anything. That was the wonder of it. There was enough. "Slow down," Clara said, sliding another batch onto the platter. "There's more than the 6 of you could eat if you ate till Sunday." "We might," Eli said, and Nell swatted his shoulder without heat. Clara had been 3 days getting used to that, to setting a table for 8 and having every seat filled, to the way the children still eyed a plate of food as though it might be snatched away, then ate as though they'd been forgiven a debt. On the first night at the ranch, they had lined their bread up along the edges of their plates, saving it, hiding crusts in their pockets when they thought she wasn't looking. She had said nothing. She had only kept cooking, morning and noon and night, until the pockets emptied and the bread stayed on the plates and got eaten warm. It took a full belly. She had learned long ago, 3 or 4 days to teach a starved child that the next meal was coming. She had learned it herself once, in a place she did not like to remember, and she had promised these 6 they would not have to learn the harder lessons she had. Through the window she could see Josiah at the corral rail with Samuel beside him. The boy stood the way he always stood, shoulders squared, ready to bolt or to fight, a 13-year-old wearing a grown man's wariness like a coat 2 sizes too big. But he was listening. Josiah had a hand on the neck of the gray mare, low and easy, and he was saying something Clara couldn't hear, and Samuel was leaning in to catch it. "He's teaching him to ride," Nell said at her elbow. The girl had come to stand close the way she did now, as though proximity were a thing she was rationing out to herself. 11 years old, and she carried the whole brood on her back like a little mother. Clara had watched her cut the twins' meat and check Toby's forehead for fever and mend Eli's shirt with a needle held in chapped fingers, all before she'd think to eat herself. "So he is," Clara said. "You want to learn." Nell's face did something complicated. "I want to learn to bake," she said low, as if it were a shameful thing to want. "Like you, so there's always bread." Clara set the towel down. "Then wash your hands," she said, "and get the flour crock. There's always bread from here on out, Nell. But it won't hurt you to know how, all the same." The girl set to it with a seriousness that made Clara's chest ache, measuring the flour level with the back of a knife the way Clara showed her, working the lard in with cold fingers, her tongue between her teeth. When the first loaf came out an hour on, lopsided and pale on one side, Nell stood over it like a soldier over a fallen comrade. "It's ugly," she said. "It's bread," Clara said. "Ugly bread feeds a person same as pretty, you made that. Nobody can take it back out of the world." She saw the words land somewhere deep in the child and lodge there, and she thought, not for the first time, that there were hungers in these children that no amount of flapjacks would ever reach, and that she meant to spend the rest of her life reaching for them anyway. They kept the children close to the house and out of sight of the road, which was the one shadow across those bright days. Josiah had moved them from the bunkhouse into the main house the second night, once he was sure no rider came up the track after dark, and the ranch swallowed them the way a big empty thing is glad to be filled. There was space enough. That was the ache of it, too. The house had been built for a family, and for 2 years it had held a widower and his silence, and now it rang from dawn to dusk with the family it had been waiting for. Clara watched it work on Josiah like sun on frozen ground. The twins had adopted him first. Rose and Ruth, 7 years old and identical down to the gap in their front teeth, had decided within a day that Josiah Reed was the tallest and safest object in the world, and they trailed him from barn to woodpile to well like 2 small ducks, holding to the hem of his coat, chattering at him in the doubled, overlapping way twins have. He never told them to hush. Clara had seen him stop dead in the middle of hauling a sack of feed, because Ruth had asked him gravely whether horses dreamed, and she'd watched him set the sack down and crouch to his heels and consider the question as though it were the most important one he'd been asked in years. "Reckon they do," he'd told her. "Reckon they dream of good grass and no rain." "Do you dream?" Rose had asked. He'd been quiet a moment. "Startin' to," he'd said, and picked the sack back up. It was Toby who undid him. The boy was 4 or near it. Nobody was quite sure, least of all Toby, who hadn't said a word in the year since the fever took his mother and father and left him standing alone in a doorway. Nell said he'd talked before, that he'd been a chatterbox, that he'd sung. Now he watched the world with enormous solemn eyes and clung to Nell's skirts and made no sound at all, not crying, not laughing, nothing. And he had, without anyone deciding it, attached himself to Josiah. It started with the boots. Josiah would sit on the porch step of an evening to pull them off, and Toby took to sitting beside him, one small body's width away, watching. Then it was a hand on the man's sleeve. Then Toby was following him through the whole of the day, a silent shadow at knee height, into the barn and out, standing at the fence while Josiah worked, riding on his shoulders when the ground got rough. Josiah bore it all without remark, but Clara saw the way his big hand would come up to steady the boy's ankle, careful as if he held something spun from glass. She was carrying the wash basket past the barn on the fourth evening when she heard Josiah's voice go strange and stop. She looked in. Josiah was kneeling in the straw, mending a length of harness, and Toby stood in front of him with one hand flat against the man's chest, and the boy's mouth was working. And then, so soft she'd have missed it if the barn hadn't been dead quiet, Toby said a word. "Pud." Just the one. Then he looked frightened at himself and buried his face in Josiah's shirt. Clara set the basket down without knowing she did it. Josiah had gone absolutely still, both arms come up around the small back, and his head was bowed over the boy's, and his shoulders shook once hard. She heard him breathe out. When he lifted his face, it was wet and unashamed and torn wide open, all the granite gone out of it, and he was looking at her over Toby's head with an expression she had no name for, grief and joy and terror all at the war together. "Clara," he said, and his voice broke on it. "I know," she said, "I heard." She came and knelt in the straw beside them, and for a while none of the three of them said anything at all, because there wasn't a word big enough, and Toby had used the only one that mattered. Later, when the children were bedded down, the twins top to tail in the little room off the kitchen, Eli and Samuel in the loft, Nell with Toby curled against her because he still would not sleep alone, Clara and Josiah sat on the porch in the cooling dark. He had brought out the coffee. Neither of them drank it. "He said it to me too," she told him. "Not Pa, but Nell asked me today." She stopped, started again. "Nell asked me straight out whether I was going to be their Ma." Josiah turned the tin cup in his hands. "What you tell her?" "Nothing, I couldn't. I stood there like a fool with the flower still on my hands." Clara pulled her shawl tighter. The night was full of frog song and the low sounds of the settling house behind them, and somewhere off in the dark a mare blew and stamped. "I've wanted things before, Josiah. When I was small in that place back east, I wanted a mother so bad I'd have taken a cruel one just to have somebody's, and nobody came, so I learned not to want it. It's a hard thing to unlearn at my age." "I know something about that," he said. "I know you do." He was quiet a long moment. The chair creaked as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the cup dangling from his fingers. "I built this house for a family," he said. 2 years back I'd have told you I'd sooner burn it than fill it with children that could be took from me. I buried a boy Toby's size, Clara. I told myself I'd not put my heart out in the road again to get run over." He turned his head and looked at her. "And here I've gone and done it anyway, 6 times over, 7 maybe." The 7th hung in the air between them. Clara felt it land. She looked at her own hands, folded tight in her lap, and she thought of Nell's face and Toby's one whispered word, and the way the house had sounded all day, and she was aware of Josiah beside her, near enough that she could have reached him without half trying, and for a moment the wanting was so strong it frightened her. "Josiah," she said. "Don't," he said gently. "Don't say it yet. If you say it and it goes wrong, I don't think I could stand it, and neither could they. Let it be enough for tonight that—" He stopped, reached out, slow, and laid his hand over both of hers where they were knotted in her lap, and the warmth of it went through her like the first fire of the season. "That it's a good house tonight, and there's small voices in it. And I mean to keep it that way, whatever it costs. That's my word, Clara. You know what my word is." "A roof that doesn't leak," she said. "That's right." They sat like that a while, his hand over hers, not speaking, and it was more than either of them had let themselves have in years, and it was almost too much, and it was not enough, and they both knew it and let it be. What they did not know, that soft and dangerous night, was that 11 miles off in Cedar Hollow, a ranch hand named Dobbs sat in the corner of the saloon 3 whiskeys past since, and talked. He hadn't meant harm by it. He was one of Josiah's own men, laid off to a neighbor's outfit for the season, proud of the boss he'd worked for, loose in the mouth the way a tired man gets when the drink is cheap and the company is listening. He didn't know the wide-shouldered stranger at the bar with the quiet eyes and the still hands. He only knew he had a story worth telling, and it had been a slow week. "Reed's got the whole place lit up like Christmas," Dobbs said, wiping foam from his lip. Rancher who ain't said good mornin' to a living soul since he put his wife in the ground, and now you go out there, you'd think he'd started a schoolhouse. A whole litter of young uns. 6 of 'em little bits of things, followin' him around like he's the almighty. Where a man like that come by 6 children overnight, I surely couldn't tell you. The stranger at the bar did not turn around, but he set down his glass very softly, and he smiled at the wall, and after a while he laid a coin on the bar and went out into the dark to where his horse was tied and rode north. Deacon Pruitt had been a long time looking for 6 children. Now he knew exactly where they were. Chapter 6, The Knock at the Door. The dogs told them first. It was past 9 in the morning, and Clara was at the long kitchen table teaching Rose and Ruth to shape their letters on a slate, when Josiah's 2 cattle dogs set up a barking that rolled across the yard like a warning bell. Josiah came in from the barn wiping his hands on a rag, and something in the set of his shoulders made Clara set down the chalk. "Riders," he said, not a question. He had heard hooves before the dogs did. Clara rose and went to the window. 3 men were coming up the wagon track at an easy, unhurried pace, the pace of men who believed they had every right to be there. The one in front sat his horse like a fence post, straight-backed and heavy-handed, a coiled bullwhip hanging from his saddle horn. She had seen that man once before, tacking a notice to the mercantile wall. Deacon Pruitt. "Take the children up to the loft," Josiah said quietly. "Now, Clara." She did not argue. She gathered the twins and called low for the others, and Nell, who could read a room faster than any child had a right to, was already herding Eli and little Toby toward the ladder stair at the back of the house. Samuel did not move. "Samuel," Clara touched his arm, "please. I'm not hiding while some man stands in the yard talking about us like we're strays." The boy's jaw was tight, his eyes older than 13. "I did that before, it didn't help." "You'll help me most by keeping the little ones quiet," Josiah said, and there was no arguing with the flat certainty of it. Samuel held his gaze a hard second, then went, though every line of him said he hated it. Josiah took his coat down from the peg. Under it, on the same nail, hung the gun belt. He looked at it a moment and left it where it was. Then he stepped out onto the porch, and Clara, against every instinct that told her to stay hidden, stepped out beside him. He glanced at her. He did not tell her to go back in. Pruitt drew rein at the gate that closed the yard from the track. The 2 men behind him spread a little, the way men do when they mean their numbers to be felt. Up close he was broad through the chest, with a face weathered to the color of a saddle and eyes gone flat from too much of the work he did. "Read," Pruitt said, touching his hat brim in a way that made the courtesy an insult. "Ma'am." He let his gaze linger on Clara a moment too long. "You'd be the new schoolteacher, small town, word gets around." "State your business," Josiah said. Pruitt reached inside his coat and drew out a folded paper, holding it up without offering it. "Come on behalf of the county almshouse. Superintendent Vance, we're missing 6 wards, runaways." He said the word like it tasted good. 2 boys, 3 girls, a little one, been told they might have wandered onto Reed land. "Told by who?" "Man hears things in town." Pruitt's mouth curved. "Now we can do this neighborly. You open that gate, let me and my men walk through your barn and your bunkhouse, and if there's nothing to find, why, we'll tip our hats and be gone before noon." "No," Josiah said. The single word sat in the cold morning air. One of the men behind Pruitt shifted in his saddle. "No," Pruitt repeated, as though he had misheard. "You're not walking my land. Not the barn, not the bunkhouse, not the henhouse." Josiah's voice never rose. That was the thing Clara would remember later, how a quiet man could make a threat sound like weather. "You've got a paper. You haven't got a warrant sworn by a judge, and until you do, that gate stays shut and you stay on the far side of it." Pruitt's eyes narrowed. "You know a good deal about warrants for a rancher." "I know a man's home is his own." Josiah came down one step, and though he was on foot and Pruitt was mounted, it was somehow Pruitt who seemed to give ground. "Bring me paper with a judge's name on it, and I'll read it standing right here. Come onto my land without it, and I'll treat you like any other trespasser. You can carry that back to Vance word for word." For a long moment nobody moved. The dogs paced the fence line, low in the chest. Then Pruitt laughed, short and without humor, and folded the notice back into his coat. "Vance thought you might be difficult." He gathered his reins. "He said if you were, I was to tell you he'd be along himself, directly." He looked once more at Clara, that same slow, measuring look. Nice for the children having such a fine lady take an interest. Be a shame if folks got the wrong idea about it. He wheeled his horse. Read, ma'am. They rode off no faster than they'd come. Clara realized her hands were shaking only when Josiah's closed over one of them, warm and steady, and drew it briefly against his arm before he let go. He'll come back, she said. He'll come back. Vance came in the middle of the afternoon, in a shining black buggy that had no business on a cattle road, Prout riding alongside, and a clerk perched behind clutching a leather case. Josiah met them at the gate again, and this time Clara did not send the children to the loft, because Vance's arrival had the flavor of a thing that could no longer be hidden from. Superintendent Ambrose Vance was a narrow man in a good coat, clean-shaven, with the pale, tidy look of someone who did his cruelty with a pen and never got it on his cuffs. He did not raise his voice either. Clara understood, watching the two men across the gate, that this was the more dangerous kind. Mr. Reed, Vance did not offer his hand, which spared them both. I'll be brief, as I've a good deal of ledgering to return to. You are, I believe, harboring 6 wards of the Cedar Hollow County almshouse. He nodded to the clerk, who produced from the leather case a sheaf of documents thick with seals and copperplate signatures. These are the certificates of guardianship, executed lawfully, filed with the county. Each of those children was surrendered or committed into the care of the almshouse, and the almshouse holds legal charge of their persons until their majority or their lawful placement. He held the papers up the way Prout had held the notice, close enough to see, too far to snatch. In the eyes of the law, Mr. Reed, those children are mine to account for, and you are a man keeping another's wards without leave. There is a word for that. You turned them out, Clara said. She could not help it. The heat that had lit in her chest since her first night in that barn rose all the way up. You put 6 children out of your doors to fend in the cold because it cost you too much to feed them, and now you come waving papers because you want them back. Vance turned his pale eyes on her unhurried. You would be Miss Bishop. He said it as though he had already made inquiries, and she understood with a cold drop in her stomach that he had. I make no admissions to a schoolteacher on a cattleman's porch. The papers are the papers. The children are on the books. A thin smile. As for what happens between the books and the world, that is the sort of thing that is very difficult to prove and very easy to deny. He tucked the documents away himself, taking his time. I am not an unreasonable man. The circuit court convenes in this district in 11 days. That gives you ample time to see reason. Surrender the children to my clerk by the close of that session, quietly and without further trouble, and I will let the matter of your harboring them rest. Refuse, the smile did not change. And I will have you before Judge Hollies on charges, Mr. Reed, and the children returned to me regardless, and you the worse for the whole business. 11 days. He nodded precisely, as if concluding a transaction. Good afternoon. The buggy turned in the yard and rolled away, Prout trailing, the dust of it hanging gold in the low sun a long while after. Josiah stood at the gate until they were out of sight. When he came back up onto the porch, his face had gone somewhere far off, and Clara knew he was seeing not Vance but a smaller graveside, an older grief. She put her hand on his sleeve to bring him back. He's right about the law, she said. It cost her to say it plainly, but plainness was all they had. That's what frightens me. It isn't that he's lying, it's that on paper he isn't. Kindness fed those children, Josiah, but kindness has no seal on it. In front of a judge, a man with papers beats a man with a good heart every time, unless— She stopped, the shape of it coming clear even as she spoke. Unless we have papers too, unless we go to that same court before that same judge and petition for custody ourselves, make it ours on paper the way it's already ours in fact. A rancher and a schoolteacher, Josiah said slowly, against a chartered institution. Against a man who put 6 children out to starve while he drew the state's money for feeding them. Her chin came up. Let him bring his ledgers into the light. I should like to see them. Something eased very slightly at the corner of Josiah's mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the first thing that had lived in his face since the buggy came. They had not heard the loft stair. They turned to find the children in the doorway, all of them. Samuel at the front with his arm thrown across Nell, and the twins, Eli pale and clinging, Toby half hidden in Nell's skirts with his great dark silent eyes fixed on Josiah. He's taking us back. Samuel's voice cracked down the middle, part fury, part the terror underneath it. In 11 days, I heard him. We should go, tonight. Me and Nell can get the little ones over the hills before. No one is going anywhere. Josiah crossed the porch and went down onto one knee so that his eyes were level with the boy's. He did not touch him. Samuel was not a boy you grabbed. Look at me, son. You've had grown men give you their word before and break it. I know that. I'm not asking you to trust the word. I'm asking you to watch what I do with it. He held Samuel's stare and did not blink. I gave you my word in that barn I'd not hand you back. I'm giving it again here in front of every one of them. Vance can bring his papers and his whip hand and his 11 days. He is not taking a single one of you off this land, not while I stand on it. The porch was very quiet. Somewhere the dogs had settled. Then Toby let go of Nell's skirt. He crossed the boards on his small, soundless feet and put his hand flat against Josiah's jaw, the way a child touches a thing to be sure it's real, and Josiah closed his eyes and let him. 11 days, Nell whispered. Is that a long time or a short time? Long enough, Clara said, and prayed it was true. She did not sleep that night. Near midnight, she took a candle out to the porch, and it was there Vance found her again. Not in the flesh this time, but in memory, in the low, even voice that would not leave her. For he had spoken to her once more at the last, while Josiah's back was turned settling the buggy horse. Vance had leaned near the gate, close enough that only she could hear, and said in that tidy, unhurried way, "A word to the wise, Miss Bishop. You are imagining a courtroom, I think, imagining you will stand up and be believed. Let me spare you." A spinster schoolteacher not 2 months in this county, and a widower the whole town calls half mad with grief. No judge alive will hand 6 children to the likes of you over a chartered institution with the state's own seal on it. You have no standing. You have no name here. You have nothing but sentiment, and sentiment does not sign custody. He had straightened, satisfied. Give them up while you can still do it gracefully. Clara stood on the porch a long time, the candle guttering in the night wind off the range, and let the words work on her the way he had meant them to. No standing, no name, nothing but sentiment. Then she thought of Eli's fever breaking under her hands, of Toby's small palm against Josiah's jaw, of a barn full of children the world had written off in a ledger and closed the book on. We'll see, she said aloud to the dark, to Vance, to the whole tight-fisted county. We will see what sentiment can sign. And somewhere in the house behind her, one of the children turned in a warm bed and slept on, safe, for one more night. Chapter 7, Building a Case. The kitchen table at the Reed Ranch had become a battlefield of paper. Clara sat at the head of it with a borrowed ledger open before her, a pot of ink going tacky at her elbow, and 3 days' worth of careful, cramped handwriting spread out beneath the lamplight. Sworn statements, dates, names, the plain arithmetic of cruelty set down in her own even hand, so that a judge who had never smelled the inside of the Hartley barn might still be made to understand what had happened there. Read it back to me, she said. The part about the ledgers. Across the table, Josiah leaned over the page with the frown of a man more used to reading weather than words. On the 14th of April, he read slowly, Superintendent Ambrose Vance did turn out from the county almshouse 6 children, ordering them to fend for themselves upon the road, while continuing to draw the state stipend paid for their keep. He looked up. That's the whole of it right there. That's the rope. If we can prove it. Clara pressed the back of her wrist to her tired eyes. A statement isn't proof. It's a story until somebody swears to it who the judge will believe. Josiah set the paper down. Then we get somebody the judge'll believe. They had spent the better part of the week doing exactly that. Clara had ridden into Cedar Hollow each morning with her chin up and her basket empty of everything but questions, and she had learned that a town which had turned its back on 6 starving children could still, when pressed, remember things. Small things. The mercantile owner, Mr. Pell, had at first wanted nothing to do with any of it. But when Clara laid it plain that the children he'd watched grow thin behind his own store had been cast out on purpose while the county drew good money for feeding them, something had shifted in the man's sun-creased face. I sold Vance 40 pounds of meal in March, Pell had said quietly, thumbing through his own accounts. State's money, he said, for the wards. He'd looked at her over his spectacles. Them children never saw an ounce of it, did they? No, Clara had said. They saw bruised apples they had to steal. Pell had written it down himself and signed it, and that had been the first crack in the wall. Others followed once the first man had gone before them. The blacksmith's wife who'd shoot a begging child from her step in November and lain awake over it since. The stable boy who'd watched Prout post his reward notice and known, somehow, that the runaways had done nothing but try to stay alive. One by one, they came to Clara's kitchen door, shamefaced, and signed their names to what they'd seen. Now back at the ranch, Clara added his account to the growing sheaf. From the next room came the low murmur of children settling toward sleep. Nell's voice, patient as a worn-smooth stone, telling the twins some story about a rabbit who outwitted a fox. Toby's silence threaded through it all, that small, watchful presence forever at the edge of any room Josiah occupied. Samuel would be out at the barn still, pretending he wasn't listening at the window, pretending he wasn't afraid. "There's the boy," Josiah said, following her glance toward the dark pane. "When Eli near died of that fever from his arm, if the doc in Junction City remembers setting it, remembers how far gone it was." "Neglect near to killing a child in county care," Clara nodded. "That's more than a story, that's a wound a doctor can name." She dipped her pen. "I'll write him tomorrow." For a while there was only the scratch of the nib and the settling ticks of the cooling stove. It was a strange thing, Clara thought, this quiet industry between them. Two people who had come to Cedar Hollow expecting nothing and were now bent together over the same lamp like a couple who had done it for 20 years. She did not let herself look at the thought too long. The turning of the town, when it came through the front door of Martha Coleman's boarding house. Clara had not asked for it, but Martha, who 3 weeks ago had been the sharpest tongue in Cedar Hollow, had taken up the children's cause with the fervor of the newly converted, and Martha Coleman with a cause was a force of nature. She gathered the town's women into her parlor over coffee and dried apple cake, and she told them plainly what Clara had found in the barn. "6 of 'em," Martha said, and let it sit. "Littlest not 4 years old, turned out to starve so a man in a black coat could keep drawing their board money for himself, and every one of us walked past that barn all winter thinking it empty." The women had shifted in their chairs. Some had children of their own asleep upstairs. When Martha passed a paper around asking them to swear they'd seen the ward children begging thin through the fall, more than half of them signed. By the time Clara arrived to thank her, Martha waved it off. "Don't thank me, girl. I ought to have looked in that barn myself." She pressed a wrapped loaf into Clara's hands. "For the little ones? And you tell that Reed man the widow Coleman said he's a better Christian than half the deacons in this county, whatever else they're saying about him." Clara's smile faltered. "What are they saying?" Martha's face closed like a door. "You'll hear it soon enough. Best you hear it from a friend." She heard it that same afternoon, from the county's own mouth. Vance did not come himself. He never dirtied his hands. But the story ran ahead of him through Cedar Hollow like water finding cracks, that the new schoolteacher was an unmarried woman of loose and reckless character, keeping odd hours and stranger company, unfit to stand before children in a classroom, let alone claim them. And Josiah Reed, well, everyone knew about Reed. Buried his wife and boy and hadn't been right since. A half-mad widower alone on a ranch with a woman not his wife and a barn full of another man's wards. What decent court would hand children into that? The school board sent word by noon that Clara's post was under review. She found Josiah at the corral fence when she rode in with the news, and she watched his jaw go tight and still as she told it. He did not curse. He did not slam his fist against the rail the way another man might. He just stood there a long moment, looking out at his own land going gold in the falling light, and when he spoke his voice was low and even and terrible. "He can't touch the children with the truth, so he's coming at us instead." "He's good at it," Clara said. Her own voice shook and she hated it. "He does it with a ledger and a rumor and never raises his hand. And it works, Josiah. That's the awful part. Half the town will believe it because it's easier than believing they let 6 children starve." Josiah turned to her. Something in his face had changed. Some door she had watched him hold shut since the night they met had come, at last, loose on its hinge. "Sit with me a minute," he said. "There's a thing you ought to know before we go any further into this." They sat on the porch step as the light went. For a while he said nothing, and Clara had learned enough of him not to push. When the words came, they came slow, dug up from deep ground. "Her name was Rebecca," he said. "My wife, we had a boy, Daniel. He'd have been 6 now." He turned his hat in his hands. "Fever came through the valley the winter of the drought, took them both inside of a week. I sat up with them every night and I couldn't do a thing but watch. Doctor was 2 days' ride and the roads were ice." He drew a breath that seemed to cost him. "I buried them under the cottonwood on the rise, and I swore to God I'd never do it again, never love another soul I could lose. Figured a man only gets asked to dig that grave once if he's got the sense to keep his heart out of the ground. Clara sat very still, and then I came to your door with a basket of stolen bread. And then, he agreed, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth and died. Then there was a little boy who won't speak, who follows me around like he knows I've got a hole in me the exact shape of him, and a girl who mothers the whole brood at 11 years old, and a teacher too stubborn to look away from a thing everybody else had made themselves not see. He looked at her then, full on, and Clara felt it go through her like the first cold of morning. I told myself I was just keeping my word, that it was duty. But it's not duty that gets a man up in the night to check a child's fever, Clara. I know the difference. I dug the grave that taught it to me. Josiah, I broke my vow, he said simply. Somewhere in the last month I broke it, and I'm not sorry. That's the thing I wanted you to know. Whatever they say about me in town, they're wrong about the reason. I'm not a half-mad widower hiding orphans. I'm a man who found his family in a barn and means to keep them. The dark had come full now. Somewhere behind them, a child laughed in its sleep. Clara realized her eyes were wet and did not bother to hide it. Then we have the same trouble, she said, because a court won't give 6 children to a spinster and a widower who only share a lamp. Vance made sure of that. On paper, we're nothing to each other and nothing to them. Josiah was quiet a long moment. On paper, he said. Yes. Then we change the paper. Clara turned to look at him. Marry me, he said. It came out plain, almost practical, a rancher pricing a fence. And then his voice dropped and roughened, and the practical fell away from it entirely. I mean it 2 ways, Clara, and I'll not pretend I don't. It gives the children 2 guardians and 1 household and takes Vance's cleanest weapon out of his hand. That's the true and useful reason, and it'd be enough on its own. He swallowed. But I'm not asking you only because it's useful. I'd be asking regardless, given a year and the courage. We just haven't got a year. The night held its breath around them. Clara thought of the asylum where she'd grown up, the long, cold rows of cots, the certainty she'd carried out of that place that no one was ever coming for anyone. She thought of 6 children asleep under this roof who had learned the same lesson in a different cold barn and were, maybe, about to be taught different. That someone did come, that a door could open and stay open, that the word * home could mean a place a person got to keep. We'll petition together, she said carefully, as one household. As one household. That's a yes to the useful reason. She found she was smiling and crying and could not stop either. Ask me the other reason again when there aren't children's lives resting on my answer. Ask me when it can just be mine to give. Josiah reached over and very gently folded her hand inside his own scarred one. I'll ask you every day after, he said, if you'll let me. They sat like that a while, hand in hand on the step, 2 grown people who had each sworn off hope and been outvoted by 6 starving children. In the morning they would go to the courthouse and file the petition jointly. They would win, Clara let herself believe. They had the truth, and they had the town half-turned, and they had each other. She never heard the fever break in the small hours. It was Nell's scream that woke the house. Eli thrashing white and burning in the bunkhouse cot. The old sickness roared back up out of his blood, and every soul on the ranch bolting from bed to crowd around the boy. Clara was pressing cool cloths to his brow, and Josiah was already saddling to ride for the doctor, and no one was watching the road. No one saw the lanterns come dark and quiet over the rise. No one saw the men. And in the noise and terror of one sick child, out beyond the ring of the lamplight, Deacon Prout made his move. Chapter 8, What the Night Took. The fever broke wrong. Clara had seen fevers break clean before, the sweat coming sudden and the skin cooling under her palm like ground after rain. Eli's did not do that. It climbed. By full dark it had him shaking so hard his teeth clattered and his eyes rolled loose in his head, seeing men and horses that weren't in the room. She wrung the cloth in the basin and laid it across his brow, and it went warm as broth before she could count to 20. Josiah, she didn't raise her voice, but he was already crossing the bunkhouse floor, boots quiet, the lamp throwing his shadow tall against the plank wall. Still climbing. He's out of his head. Josiah knelt and pressed the back of 2 fingers to the boy's throat, then his chest. His mouth went flat and careful, the way it did when a thing was worse than he meant to say aloud. Nell, he said over his shoulder. Fetch the willow bark off the shelf and set the kettle to boiling again. Samuel, more wood on that stove. The children moved. They always moved for him now, quick and trusting, and Clara felt the small ache of that even in the middle of her fear, how far they had come, from the barn and the pitchfork to this. A boy of 13 feeding the stove because a man asked him plainly. Rose and Ruth had drawn back into the far bunk, holding hands, watching Eli with the grave stillness of children who have already learned what death looks like when it comes for one of their own. Toby had crawled into the tangle of blankets at Josiah's knee and would not be moved from it. He clutched a fistful of the man's shirt and pressed his silent face to Josiah's ribs. For a while there was only work, the bark steeping bitter and pale, Clara spooning it between Eli's cracked lips, most of it running down his chin. Josiah stripping the sweat-soaked blanket and laying a dry one, then a cool cloth, then another. The lamp burning low and being trimmed, the night pressing black against the little windows. It was the dogs that told them, and by then it was already too late. Josiah's head came up first. Out in the yard, the 2 ranch dogs had gone from barking into that high frantic pitch that meant men, not coyotes. Then a horse blew, close, and another, and boots hit the packed dirt of the yard all at once. Too many boots, moving fast, moving like men who already knew the ground. "Stay with him," Josiah said, and he was on his feet and to the door, and he had the bar half up when it burst inward against his shoulder and threw him back. They came in with lanterns and clubs. Clara had time to see Prute's face in the swinging light, the wide, flat cheeks, the small, satisfied eyes, and behind him 2 men she didn't know and one she did, Vance's driver. And then the room was all noise and lunging shadow. "By order of the county," Prute was saying, loud, reciting it like scripture. "6 wards of the Cedar Hollow almshouse unlawfully harbored. Every child in this room is coming with me." "You've no warrant to set foot." Josiah got that far and Prute hit him. Not a fight's blow, a hunter's, short and brutal, the club catching Josiah across the temple, and the big man went down against the bunk frame with a sound Clara felt in her own teeth. After that it came apart. Samuel threw himself at the nearest man with both fists, all 13 years of him, screaming at the twins to run. He got one good blow in before the man caught his collar and flung him into the wall. Nell had Ruth by the arm, dragging her toward the back, but there was no back, only more men filling the doorway, and one of them scooped Rose off her feet as easy as lifting a sack of meal, and she shrieked and kicked the air. Clara was on her feet with the basin still in her hands. She did the only thing left to her. She put her body between the men and the bunk where Eli lay burning. "This child is sick," she said, and she heard her own voice come out steady and terrible. "He cannot be moved. He will die on the road." "I am telling you he will die." "Then he'll die on county ground," Prute said and reached past her. She hit him, she swung the basin and caught him across the jaw, and the water went everywhere, and for one instant his head snapped sideways. Then his hand closed on her wrist and twisted, and the basin dropped, and he shoved her down hard enough that the floor came up and knocked the wind clean out of her. She lay with the boards against her cheek, gasping, watching a pair of scuffed boots step over her toward the bunk. The worst of it was Toby. They had all of them by then, Samuel bleeding from the mouth, and held by 2 men, Nell and the twins bundled crying toward the door, Eli lifted limp and unresisting off the mattress. And Josiah, half-conscious against the bunk frame, his face running red, had gotten his arm around the one child who had never let go of him. Toby had his fists knotted in Josiah's shirt and his face buried and his whole small body shaking, and Josiah's arm was around him like the last plank of a wrecked boat. "That one too," Prute said. No, Josiah's voice was wrecked, but there was iron still in it, iron and something worse, something breaking. "No, leave the boy, he doesn't." They pried Toby loose. It took 2 of them. And the child who had not made a sound in over a year, the child whose silence Clara had come to think of as a locked door with a whole grieving house behind it, Toby opened his mouth and screamed. One long, ragged, wordless scream, torn out of him. His arms flung back toward Josiah as they carried him through the door into the dark. Josiah tried to rise. He got to one knee and Prute's man put him down again with the club, and Clara heard herself cry out, and then there were fewer of them in the room, and then there were none. Only the wet stove hissing and the door swinging on its hinge and the sound of the wagon out in the yard, and the horses, and the crying growing thin and then gone. She crawled to Josiah. His eye was closing purple and the blood sheeted down from his hairline, but he was awake. He was trying to get his legs under him. "Which way?" he said thickly. "Clara, which way'd they?" "Don't," she had her hands on his face. "Don't, you can't ride, you can't even stand." The next men who came were not Proots. They came with the sheriff's badge and a warrant of their own, and it was worded so smooth Clara knew Vance had drawn it days ago and held it in his pocket like a snake. Assault upon a county officer in the discharge of his duty. Unlawful harboring of chartered wards. They took Josiah out of his own bunkhouse with his hands bound and his blood not yet dry. And the last she saw of him that night was his face turned back toward her over his shoulder, saying her name, saying wait, before they put him on a horse and rode him toward the town lockup. They left her the empty room. She did not remember walking to the house. She found herself standing in the kitchen where Nell had learned to knead bread, where 2 nights ago Rose had climbed on a chair to reach the sugar and gotten caught and laughed. And the room was so full of the shapes of them and so entirely empty that Clara sat down on the floor with her back against the cold stove and could not get up. For a long while she was not a woman of 26 with a schoolhouse and a purpose. She was 7 years old. She was 7, and it was the asylum back east, the long dormitory with its rows of iron beds, and the matron's step in the hall, and the particular smell of lye and cold porridge that meant no one was coming for you, not tonight, not ever, that you were a line in a book and the book did not love you. She had lain awake in that place counting the cracks in the ceiling because if she counted she did not cry, and if she did not cry they left her be. She had learned to make herself small. She had learned that the world was arranged by men with ledgers, and the ledgers always won, and a child's want weighed nothing at all against a column of figures. That was where Vance had them now, in a room like that. Nell would be trying to keep the twins from crying too loud. Samuel would be planning something reckless. Eli would be burning up on a bare tick mattress with no one to wring the cloth. And Toby, who had found his voice only to have it torn out of him screaming, Toby would have gone silent again, folded back down inside himself where nothing could reach. Clara pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The hearing was at 9. She looked at the black window and could not tell it was 3, maybe 4 hours off. Josiah was in a cell. She had no husband, no standing, no papers, a sick child stolen away, and a chartered institution with the whole letter of the law folded neat in its pocket. Vance had told her plainly on the porch a week ago. A spinster schoolteacher and a half-mad widower will never be granted children over an institution. And he had made sure of it. He had made sure Josiah would stand before the judge with a jail smell on him if he stood at all. It was hopeless. She let herself think the whole word, hopeless. And then, sitting on the cold floor with her arms around her knees, Clara heard a different thing under the grief, small and hard and rising, like the first coal you find still live in a dead-looking fire. She was not 7 years old. That was the thing the matron and the ledger and Ambrose Vance were all counting on, that somewhere inside every grown person they'd starved was still that small, silent child who believed she weighed nothing. But Clara had grown. She had crossed a country. She had walked into a dark barn full of frightened children and not looked away, and she had made them a promise, and Josiah had made them a promise, a roof that doesn't leak, and a promise was not nothing. A promise was the whole of it. She was not the child in the iron bed anymore. She was the one who could fight. Clara got up off the floor. She washed her face in the basin and pinned her hair and put on the good gray dress, the one meant for the hearing, because she was going to that courthouse if she had to walk every mile of it. She would stand in front of the judge herself if no one else was left to stand. She thought of the sworn statements in her satchel, the mercantile man's account, the record of the almshouse turning children out to starve while it still drew their stipends. Fraud, she thought, cold and clear now where before there had only been fear. Not charity against charter, fraud against the state. That was a thing even a ledger could be made to answer for. She was lacing her boots when the horses came up the road at dawn. She was at the window with her heart in her throat before she recognized them, not Prout, not the sheriff, but a wagon full of women, Martha Coleman up on the box with the reins in her fists and her jaw set like a woman driving to war. Behind her, 3 more from the town, wrapped against the early cold. Martha climbed down before the wheels had stopped. "We heard," she said. "Whole town heard by midnight, that man crowing about it in the road. We took up a collection, Clara, every woman with a coin to spare and some who hadn't." She held up a knotted handkerchief heavy with money. "It's Josiah's bail. The sheriff'll take it at first light. I made sure he knows we'll all of us be watching whether he does." Her hard eyes softened just once. "You're not standing alone in that courthouse, girl. Not while I draw breath." Clara took the old woman's hands and held them and could not for a moment speak at all. Then she said, "Then let's go get our children back." Chapter 9, The Claim. The courthouse in Cedar Hollow was a plain room with a plank floor and a stove that smoked, but that morning it was full to the walls. Clara Bishop walked in with Eli wrapped against her chest, his fever a low heat she could feel through 2 blankets, and every head turned. She did not slow. She had learned as a child in the asylum that the surest way to be trampled was to hesitate. Judge Hollis sat behind a table that had been a card table any other day of the week. An old man with reading spectacles pushed down his nose and a face that gave nothing away. At his own table, Superintendent Ambrose Vance had spread his ledgers like a banker come to foreclose. He wore a clean black coat. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the papers, and he looked pleased with them. Josiah Reed came in behind her, and the whole room seemed to breathe wrong at the sight of him. Martha and the townswomen had posted his bail at dawn, and he still carried the night in the jail on him. A split lip, a bruise going yellow along his jaw, the careful way he held his ribs. But he crossed to Clara and stood at her shoulder like a wall set down between her and the rest of the world, and she felt the floor go steadier under her feet. "You look terrible," she murmured. "I've looked worse." His eyes went to the bundle in her arms. "How is he?" "Alive, burning. I want the judge to see him burning." Josiah nodded once. That was the whole of their strategy. Judge Hollis rapped a knuckle on the table. "We'll have order. Superintendent, you've filed for the return of 6 wards of the almshouse. State your case and be brief. I've got a docket." Vance rose. He spoke the way a man reads a bill of sale. The children, he never once called them children, only wards, only charges, were the lawful responsibility of the chartered institution he directed. He held guardianship papers signed by the county. He produced them. He produced the reward notices. He had a great deal of paper, and paper in that room had the weight of stone. "These 2 individuals," Vance said, and now he did glance at Clara and Josiah, one flick of contempt. "A schoolmistress of no family and a widower of no fixed temperament have harbored my wards against the law, resisted their lawful retrieval, and assaulted an officer of the almshouse in the doing. The charter is plain, Your Honor. The papers are plain. Sentiment is not a party to this court." He sat, on the letter of it he was winning, and every soul in the room knew it. Clara felt the certainty settle over the crowd like cold. "Miss Bishop," the judge said, "you've something to say, I'm told." "Say it." Clara stepped forward. She did not give Eli to anyone. She wanted the weight of him in her arms when she spoke. "His name is Eli," she said. "He is 9 years old. He is sick with a fever that near killed him twice because for the better part of a winter no one fed him. I'd like the court to know that before it hears another word about paper." The room was very quiet. "Superintendent Vance says these children are his wards. I won't argue it. The paper says so. But I'll tell you what the paper does not say." Her voice did not shake, and that surprised her. "It does not say that last autumn the almshouse turned 6 children out its doors and told them to fend for themselves. It does not say they lived in the Hartley barn, eating bruised apples out of the mercantile's rubbish, a 4-year-old among them. It does not say that all the while the almshouse went on drawing the state's stipend for their keep. Every month, on the books, money paid to feed children who were put out to die." A sound moved through the crowd, low and ugly. "That is not guardianship, Your Honor. That is theft from the state and something worse than theft from 6 children. And I have witnesses." Judge Hollis's spectacles had come up his nose somewhere in the middle of it. "You'd best," he said, "produce them." She did. Martha Coleman came first, the boarding-house widow who had once been the town's fiercest gossip, and she stood with her chin up and swore she had seen the notices go up in November and had heard, from Vance's own hired man in his cups, that the almshouse rolls were trimmed for the winter, while the stipend went on unchanged. Then the mercantile owner admitted that, yes, he'd found the barrel behind his store gone through night after night, and known children were doing it, and God forgive him he'd said nothing because he was afraid, and it had eaten at him ever since. "I should have spoke," he said to the floor. "I'm speaking now." Vance rose smoothly. "Rumor, drink talk, and a grocer's guilty conscience. Your Honor, where is this ledger they speak of? I have mine here." "Do you see a line that reads as this woman claims?" "No," Clara said, "because a man who would starve children keeps 2 sets of books, but you can send to the state auditor. Count how many wards Cedar County drew money for last winter, then count how many were in the almshouse to eat it. For the first time, something crossed Vance's face that was not contempt, the quick, cold calculation of a man doing sudden arithmetic and not liking the sum. "I have a witness of my own," Clara said. "One of the wards himself, Samuel." They had brought the boy from the almshouse under guard, and Vance had allowed it gladly, certain he would be too frightened to do anything but stand mute. Samuel was 13 and thin as a fence rail, with a fresh bruise on his cheekbone that matched, near enough, the one on Josiah's jaw. He walked to the front with his fists closed and his shoulders squared, so much a small copy of the man beside Clara that someone in the crowd made a soft, wounded sound. "Son," Judge Holly said, not unkindly, "you understand you're to tell the truth here." "I always tell the truth," Samuel said. "It's grown folks that lie." He looked straight at Vance. "You put us out. You stood on the almshouse step and told us there wasn't food enough and to go on and not trouble the county. I carried Toby the whole way to that barn. He wasn't but 3 then. We near froze. Eli got sick and we thought he'd die and couldn't do a thing but hold him." His voice cracked and he pushed through it. "Then the teacher came, and then Mr. Reed came and gave us his word he wouldn't hand us back, and he never did. Not when your men came. He stood in front of us. He's the only grown man ever kept a word he gave me." "That's enough," Vance said sharply. "It ain't near enough," said Samuel, "but it's true." It was then that Toby moved. No one had counted on Toby. He was 4 years old and had not said a word to a living soul in more than a year, not since fever took his mother and father, and Martha had brought him only because there was no one to leave him with. He had been sitting on Martha's lap at the back, a small, silent shadow with enormous eyes. And now he slid off her knees and walked up the center of that crowded room, past the benches, past the ledgers, past Vance, not sparing the superintendent a glance, and he walked to Josiah Reed and reached up and took the big man's hand in both of his and held on. The room went to pieces quietly. Grown men looked at the floor. Martha wept into her handkerchief. Josiah looked down at the child holding his hand, and his ruined, bruised face broke in a way Clara had never seen it break, not even the night he'd told her about the wife and boy he'd buried. Judge Hollies took his spectacles off and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its docket entirely. "I've heard about all the law I can stand for one morning," he said, "and now I'd like to hear about something else. Somebody has got to stand as guardian to these children, guardian in fact, not on some ledger that draws money and turns babies out to freeze. So I'll ask it plain. Who'll have them, not the county? Who?" Josiah Reed let go of no one. He kept Toby's small hands folded in one of his, reached out with the other and took Clara's hand before the whole town and rose. "I will," he said. The room stilled. "These are my children." He said it low, but it carried into every corner of that plank room. "The tall one that just told you the truth, he's mine. The girl at home that mothers the rest, mine. The twins and the sick one this woman's holding, and this one right here." His hand tightened around Toby's. "Everyone is mine, and has been since the night I gave my word in that barn. I'll keep it till they put me in the ground." Then he looked at Clara, and every hard year fell off his face. "And this," he said, quieter still, the whole of it meant for her and given to the court only because it had asked, "This is my wife, if she'll have me." Clara had come into that room ready to lose everything and fight anyway. She had not been ready for this. She looked up at him, at the split lip, and the bruise and the 6 children's whole lives balanced in his steady hand around hers, and found that the answer had been in her a long time, only waiting to be asked. "Yes," she said. "I'll have you." Judge Hollies let the sound in the room run its course, then brought his knuckle down on the card table like a gavel. "Then here is my order, and the state auditor can take it up with me if he likes. Joint custody of these 6 children is granted to the household of Josiah and Clara Reed, this being the first honest guardianship any of them has known." He looked at Vance, and there was no old man softness in it now. "And I am ordering an inquiry into the accounts of the Cedar County almshouse, effective this hour. Superintendent, you'll surrender your ledgers, both sets, to the clerk and not leave this county pending audit. You've drawn your last stipend." Vance did not sit. He stood clutching the papers that had meant everything and now meant a rope tightening. At the back, Deacon Pruitt was already gone, the door swinging on an empty frame where the enforcer had been. But there was nowhere in Cedar County left to ride. It was over. Clara understood it the way you understand sunrise, not all at once, but as a thing already happened while you braced for the dark. Samuel crossed the floor and pressed himself against Josiah's side, too old to and doing it anyway. And Eli stirred against Clara's chest, opened his fever-bright eyes, and croaked in a small, dry voice, "Did we win?" "We won," she whispered into his hair. "Every one of us." Outside, the morning had gone bright and cold and clean, and the town of Cedar Hollow had spilled onto the courthouse steps ahead of them, not the tight-fisted, wary town that had greeted Clara off the stage those weeks ago. Nell came up the road at a run with the twins in their pinafores on either side of her, and when she saw Samuel free and Toby's hand in Josiah's, she stopped dead and put both hands over her mouth. Josiah went down the steps and gathered them, without haste and without a wasted motion, and yet Clara had never seen a man move with such urgency to be gentle. He knelt in the middle of them so the little ones did not have to look up, and Clara knelt with him, the 6 children folded close in the ring of the 2 of them, the town watching and for once holding its tongue. "Listen to me," Josiah said, and his voice had gone rough and low, meant only for the small circle of them. "All of you. There's a thing I need you to hear, and I need you to believe it because you've been lied to by better-dressed men than me, and I know it's hard." Nell's eyes were streaming. "Say it," she whispered. "They're ours now," Josiah said. "All of you, every last one. No more barns, no more running, no more grown folks handing you back. You've got a ma," he looked at Clara, and something passed between them that would outlast the town and the county and every ledger ever kept. "And you've got a pa, and you've got each other, and you've got a place. It's ours and it's yours, and nobody is taking it. You're home." He said the last word softest of all, and it landed like the first warm day after a hard winter, slow, and then all at once, and then everywhere. "Home," Nell breathed, and little Toby, still holding on, pressed his face against Josiah's shoulder, and though he had not yet found the word again, every soul near swore afterward that the child had smiled. Chapter 10. Home. The morning of the wedding, Cedar Hollow woke to the smell of bread. Martha Coleman had commandeered Josiah's kitchen at first light, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge she had 4 loaves cooling on the sill and a 5th in the oven, and she was crying into her apron between everyone. She swore it was the heat. Nobody believed her, and nobody said so. Out in the yard, the barn stood open to the July light. Somewhere along the way, it had stopped being the place where 6 starving children had hidden in the dark and become something else. The reed hands had swept it clean and hung the crossbeams with wildflowers the twins had gathered, armfuls of black-eyed Susan and blue flax, tied off with twine because there was no ribbon within 20 miles. Benches ran down both sides. A plank altar stood at the far end where the horse stalls used to be. Clara stood in the doorway of the ranch house and looked at all of it, and could not, for a moment, make her feet move. "You'll wear a groove in that floor," Martha said behind her, coming with a hairbrush. "Turn around, your braid's coming loose, and I won't have you married looking like you fought a badger." "I keep thinking someone's going to ride up the road with a paper," Clara said quietly, "and tell me it was all a mistake." "Let them try." Martha turned her by the shoulders and set to work on the braid. "Judge Hollis signed those custody orders with his own hand, and I watched him do it. There's no paper left that matters more than that one." She paused, brush in the air. "Vance won't be writing any papers where he's going, child. Not for a good long while." It was true, and Clara let herself hold it. The circuit had come down hard once the fraud was out in the open. The almshouse drawing state stipends for children it had turned out to starve. The ledgers doctored. The missing wards listed as fed and housed and schooled while they were eating bruised apples behind the mercantile. Superintendent Ambrose Vance had gone from the courthouse to a cell, and the almshouse itself was under new oversight now, a board of honest men from 3 counties who visited unannounced. And Deacon Prout had not waited for the law. He had ridden out of Cedar Hollow the same night the verdict came down, and no one had seen his horse since. "There," Martha said, and stepped back. "Now you look like a bride." Clara turned to the little mirror by the door. She hardly knew the woman in it, not the girl from the orphan asylum back east, counting spoons of thin gruel, learning young that no one was coming. That girl had spent a lifetime waiting for a door to open. This woman was about to walk through one on her own 2 feet. They came from all over the county. That was the thing Clara had not expected, the wagons, the buggies, the families on foot in their Sunday best. More of Cedar Hollow than she had ever seen gathered in one place that wasn't a funeral. The same town that had greeted her off the stage with cold eyes and tight fists. The same town that had been afraid of one extra mouth, let alone 6. Fear was a strange thing, Josiah had told her once. It made people small, but it could turn, and when it turned all at once, and then they were ashamed of how small they'd been and tried to make it up to you tenfold. Half the pies on the long tables in the yard were apology pies. Clara found she could forgive a town for a great deal when it showed up with its arms full. The children stood in a row by the barn door in their first new clothes, real cloth, cut and sewn for them and no one else, not handed down or stamped with an almshouse mark. Nell kept smoothing the front of her dress as though she couldn't quite believe it would stay hers. She was 11 and she looked, for the first time since Clara had met her, like a child instead of a small, tired woman. "You don't have to hold anybody's hand today," Clara told her, crouching down. "You know that, not one of them. Today you just get to be a girl at a wedding." Nell's chin trembled. "Who's going to watch Toby?" "I am, Josiah is, every grown person in this yard." Clara took her small hands and stilled them. "That was never your job, Nell. It's ours now. You did it because you're brave and there was nobody else. There's somebody else now." Nell looked at her a long moment, and then she did something Clara had not seen her do in all these weeks. She let go. Her shoulders came down from around her ears, and she let out a long breath, and she went to sit on the front bench like a guest. Samuel stood at the end of the row, 13 and trying to look older, his collar buttoned to the throat. He'd grown 2 inches on ranch food and steady sleep, and there was color in a face that had been gray with hunger. Josiah had put him in charge of the horses for the day, and he wore the responsibility like a badge. "You clean up decent," Clara told him. "Mr. Reed says I'm to ride fence with him come fall," Samuel said, ducking his head. "Says a man ought to have work he can point to." He glanced at her sidelong, still testing, still half-braced for it all to be snatched away. That would take longest to leave him, she knew. "He means it right, all of it." "His word's a roof that doesn't leak," Clara said. "You told me once you didn't believe in that." "Do you now?" Samuel looked out at the yard, at the flowers and the pies and the families, at the twins already crouched by the fence marking out where their garden would go. "Yeah," he said, rough. "I guess I do." Josiah found her behind the house before the ceremony, in the 10 quiet minutes Martha had fought to give them. He'd shaved and put on the good dark coat that had hung untouched in his wardrobe since the last time he'd stood before a preacher, the day he'd married the wife he'd buried, the wife whose fever had taken her and their boy in the same hard week, and left him a silent man hauling feed through town. Clara knew what that coat cost him to put on. She reached up and straightened the collar he'd already straightened twice. "You can still run," he said. "I'll give you a horse and a good start." "Josiah Reed." "I'm only saying a man ought to be honest about the bargain." But there was the ghost of a smile under it. "You're taking on 6 children and a broke-down widower and a barn full of nothing. It's not much of a trade." "It's everything I ever wanted and didn't dare ask for," Clara said. "So don't you tell me it's not much." He went still. Then his big hand came up and cupped the side of her face, careful as if she were something that might spook, and she leaned into it. "I swore I'd never do this again," he said low. "After them, I told God and I told myself. I built the whole rest of my life around never again." His thumb moved along her cheekbone. "And then you walked out to that barn with bread in a basket, and no more sense than to think you could save 6 children by yourself." "I wasn't by myself for long." "No," he said. "You weren't." He bent his forehead to hers. "You gave me my life back, Clara, you and them. I'd have gone in the ground behind that plow and never known there was anything else left for me. I mean to spend what I've got left saying thank you." "You can start," she said, "by marrying me before Martha comes looking." The preacher was a plain man, and he kept it plain. There were no rings, there hadn't been time, and it didn't matter. When he asked who gave this woman, there was a beat of silence because Clara had no family to give her and had said as much, and had thought it wouldn't hurt. Then Samuel stood up from the horses, and Nell stood, and Eli well and whole now, the fever a bad memory in a healed arm, and Rose and Ruth hand in hand, and Josiah bent down and lifted Toby up onto his hip. "We do," Samuel said, for all of them. Clara had to press her lips together hard, and it was no use. The tears came anyway, and beside her Josiah's jaw was working and losing. They said the words. Josiah's voice didn't shake until the end, and then it did, and he let it. Clara said hers clear. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and the whole yard erupted, hats in the air, Martha wailing openly now and not blaming the heat. And in the noise of it, Toby, who had not spoken in the year since he'd lost his own mother and father. Toby the town had called simple. Toby who had only ever whispered one word once, to Josiah in the dark. Toby reached from Josiah's arms toward Clara. "Ma," he said, clear as a bell so the whole yard heard it and hushed. Then he turned his small face up to the man holding him. "Pa." The barn went so quiet you could hear the flax nodding in the breeze. Then Clara took him from Josiah and held him against her, and Josiah folded his arms around them both, and the town of Cedar Hollow watched a family close its circle, and had the grace, this time, to weep with them instead of at them. The dancing went past dark. Fiddle and lantern light, the twins asleep at last in a heap of borrowed quilts, Eli having eaten enough cake to founder a mule. One by one, the wagons rattled off down the county road, until the yard was empty and swept with moonlight, and the only sound left was the crickets. Josiah and Clara carried the children up to bed, 6 of them now, in a house that had rung with silence for 2 years and would never be silent again. Toby went down still clutching Josiah's finger, and let go only when sleep took him. Nell slept without her arm thrown over anyone, guarding no one at rest. Then the 2 of them went out onto the porch, and Josiah pulled her in under his arm, and they looked out at the dark shape of the barn against the stars. "Hard to credit," he said, "what it used to hold. Frightened children in the cold," Clara murmured, "waiting for somebody to come." "Somebody came," he kissed the top of her head. "You came." Below them the barn stood full of the day's flowers and the smell of bread and the tracks of children who had run through it laughing, who would run through it tomorrow and the day after and all the days there were. A place that had hidden the forgotten now stood warm and lit and belonging to somebody, the way a home ought to. "Say it," Clara whispered, "the way you said it on the courthouse steps. I want to hear it in our own doorway." Josiah drew her closer, and he lowered his voice to the softest thing she had ever heard from him, the vow that had been building since the first night he turned his horse toward that barn instead of home. "They're ours now," he said, "all of them, and you're mine and I'm yours, and none of us are ever going hungry or afraid or alone again as long as I'm standing." He looked at her in the dark, and the grief that had lived so long in his eyes had somewhere along the way turned into something else. "This is home, for all of us, for good." Clara Bishop Reed, teacher, wife, and at last, a mother leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and stayed. Inside, the house was full. Outside, the barn kept watch. And over Cedar Hollow the stars wheeled slow and steady toward a morning that, for the first time in any of their lives, none of them had any reason to fear.